All right, so let's go ahead and turn this over to Tom Remington, who's been introduced, and Pat Deibert with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and I will hand it over to you two.
Great, thank you so much, Susan. Tom?
I was just saying, go ahead, Pat.
Okay, thanks. First of all, Tom and I are going to very briefly discuss the wildlife that occur in the sagebrush ecosystem, and I want to acknowledge all the folks who contributed to this section within Part A of the sagebrush strategy. We are just providing the summary of that effort. There were numerous experts that provide the information, and I encourage you to look to that document as soon as it is available. Next slide, please. As Dave described, are we on the next slide? Thank you. As Dave described, the sagebrush ecosystem is actually it's not a monotypic landscape, but rather it's composed of a great diversity of different plant communities, and as such supports a great diversity of wildlife species. And as Drew pointed out, that number is often cited as 350 different species that depend on the sagebrush ecosystem at one point of its life cycle. Rest assured, I'm not going to talk about all 350 species in the next few minutes here. But rather, I want to focus on a few that demonstrate the diversity of wildlife use of sagebrush, and also a few that are key species for many of our publics. The reason this is important is that if we understand how a species uses the sagebrush ecosystem, then we can understand how to develop management strategies that consider the needs of those species. Next slide, please. So what is a sagebrush species? And not all species are sagebrush obligates as defined on this page, but there are some of those that are considered sagebrush obligates, meaning they are completely dependent upon sagebrush or the associated plant communities. If we lose sagebrush for these species, the habitat function is lost, and eventually the species themselves are lost. Some examples that are on this slide include our poster children for the sagebrush ecosystem, the greater and Gunnison sage-grouse, which are dependent on sagebrush for all seasons. Additionally, sage thrasher, 93% of sagebrush thrasher distribution occurs within the sagebrush ecosystem, and they use sagebrush for nesting. And I want to note that they use sagebrush very differently. They have a very different habitat use for sagebrush than do sage-grouse. Again, demonstrating the diversity of how wildlife use this habitat. Also, we have the sagebrush vole, which occurs only where sagebrush is the dominant shrub cover and dependent upon sagebrush in the winter for forage. Next slide, please. Sagebrush near obligates include those species where the breeding distribution is almost entirely occurs within the sagebrush ecosystem, or the highest density of that species occurs within sagebrush itself. A few examples include the green-tailed towhee, which inhabits over 82% of the sagebrush ecosystem, and nests in these tall, dense sagebrush stands. Sagebrush lizards primarily occur in sagebrush, and while they can go into other habitats, the loss of sagebrush does result in the loss of the species, and we receive reduced species density. Pronghorn feed on a variety of forage, but they depend on sagebrush in the winter, and they select sagebrush for their forage and also their migration corridors. And then the Great Basin pocket mice, they need good shrub cover provided by sagebrush, which then produces the understory, which is a food source for the species. Next slide, please. Sagebrush-dependent species include those species that use an overlap, can use a variety of habitats, but the distribution will overlap significantly with sagebrush. And often in these cases, sagebrush provides an important seasonal habitat. Examples here include the white-tailed prairie dog, which primarily occur in sagebrush, but primarily occur in grasslands, but without sagebrush cover, they will not be able to successfully migrate and create other new colonies to keep the species going, particularly after disease event. Loggerhead shrike also inhabit open country and are seen quite widely. However, they build a lot of their nests in sagebrush shrubs, and their range significantly overlaps with the sagebrush ecosystem. Desert night snakes also occur in a variety of habitats, but are most abundant in sagebrush communities. And this is one of the species of reptiles that has been shown to benefit from the large set-aside of sagebrush habitats for the benefit of other species. Next slide. Sagebrush associates are species that typically use other sagebrush habitat types, but they can also forage and breed within the sagebrush ecosystem. Sagebrush associates will also include species that may be affected by sagebrush management activities. And a couple of examples of that include the pinyon jay, which is a species that depends entirely on pinyon juniper habitats, but those habitats frequently overlap with sagebrush. Management of pinyon junipers for the benefit of sagebrush wildlife or domestic grazing can often have significant impacts on this declining species. Similarly, the Wyoming pocket gopher has its entire distribution within the sagebrush ecosystem, but it does not depend at all on sagebrush to survive. What is important here is management of the sagebrush where the species occurs could affect the management of that species as well. Next slide, please. Many of these previous species I just very briefly covered are considered to have special habitat management considerations at much more local scales, such as being species of greatest conservation need status in some states. But we also have a few species that are a little more wide-ranging, and there are several, they have special management significance and or social economic value to our public. And each of these species I'm going to cover next received a special emphasis in our original, or Part A of the strategy. The first is mule deer. And as indicated by the range map, mule deer are widely distributed across the sagebrush ecosystem, and they are in fact considered sagebrush dependents. The concern here with our mule deer is sagebrush it provides critical migratory paths and winter range, but they are mostly below management objectives set by the western states, and all western states have, as a result, have developed an active management strategy for the mule deer themselves. Mule deer are also a key species for many of our states, our provinces, and our publics for economic and recreational value. Next slide, please. Similarly, the pronghorn is also a sagebrush-dependent species. It can occur out in the grasslands, but it uses sagebrush almost exclusively for forage in the winter. Additionally, many migratory routes for pronghorn occur across sagebrush ecosystems. Over half of the population of pronghorn occur within the state of Wyoming, and connectivity to maintain populations is essential. Pronghorn are also an important sagebrush species for states, provinces, and our public. Next slide, please. The greater and Gunnison sage-grouse are true sagebrush obligates. They use sagebrush across all landscapes and all seasons, and they co-evolved within this ecosystem. The loss of sagebrush will be lost in these species. As you all know, greater sage-grouse have been petitioned no less than 8 times under the Endangered Species Act and have undergone 3 Endangered Species Act reviews, with the primary concerns being habitat loss and degradation and lack of sufficient regulatory mechanisms to conserve the habitat. Species was determined to be not warranted in 2015 as a result of conservation commitments. However, there are commitments, even though we can do conservation commitments, there are some things that are challenging for conservation, such as losing sagebrush to fire, as we've lost nearly 21% of our sagebrush priority habitats in the Great Basin since 2000. Sage-grouse is listed as a threatened species in Canada and as a state-listed species in the state of Washington. Gunnison sage-grouse only remains in about a very small portion of its historic habitat in 8 isolated populations, of which 1 contains 85% of all remaining birds. Each of these populations has its own management strategy, and a recovery plan for the entire species is now being drafted with Fish and Wildlife Service with assistance from our partners. The species was listed as a threatened species under the Endangered Species Act in 2014 and has been listed as an endangered species by the International Union of Conservation Networks since 2000. Our next slide, please. Pygmy rabbits, possibly one of the most adorable occupants of the sagebrush ecosystem, has a very patchy distribution and as such is very hard to monitor or develop conservation numbers. Pygmy rabbits also use sagebrush very differently than some of our other sagebrush species that we talked here today, and it has been petitioned for listing under the Endangered Species Act. A great deal of its habitat has been burned in the last 20 years, and we've lost what we estimate to be 13 to 17% of its habitat in the Great Basin. While pygmy rabbits may not be as well known as some of the more iconic species I just discussed, it is an important sagebrush occupant that is at risk and has a need for significant management for the long-term conservation. Next slide, please.
Actually, I think this is where I jump in, isn't it, Pat?
I think so, except this slide is out of order.
Oh,
But please feel free to take over, Tom.
All right, well, if we need to come back to you, we will. So the question is, how do we manage sagebrush landscapes for this diversity of species? And since 2010, when the warranted but precluded decision came down, with a finding of, one of the findings was an inadequate regulatory authority. There was a mad scramble by state and federal agencies to buttress their both protections and positive conservation actions for sage grouse, and called one of the largest conservation efforts in history. So the question, I think it's sort of a hope right now that this umbrella species concept will help us to preserve other species. That if you have a large, a species with a large distribution, landscape scale species like sage grouse, and you protect that habitat, you will also protect the habitat for some of these other species and hopefully avoid negative impacts from management actions for sage grouse like conifer removal that Pat mentioned. Next slide, please. But if you look at it closely, it may be that the sage grouse umbrella is too small even for sage grouse. At least the regulatory protections within core areas that state and federal agencies are using are called priority habitat management areas at the federal level, core areas at many of the state, but they're pretty much the same places. And those abbreviated PHMAs, those PHMAs actually only cover about a third of occupied sage grouse range. So if you're not protecting all the habitat of the landscape's umbrella species, you're probably not going to pick up all of those species. Next slide, please. So this shows the same PHMA layer for sage grouse, the priority habitats for sage grouse, overlaying on that tan color, at least on my screen, is where sagebrush occurs on the landscape with a canopy with a cover of 5% or more from Colin Homer's work. And you can see it only covers about a quarter of the sagebrush extent. And in places like Arizona and New Mexico with no sage grouse, clearly no priority habitats for sage grouse, the sage grouse umbrella is not going to be particularly helpful. So it's a pretty small coverage is the bottom line. Next slide, please. I do want to be fair, however, because there has been some literature, Copeland et al. Found that because conservation efforts for sage grouse extend beyond protections, avoidance, minimization, mitigation efforts, conservation easements in particular for sage grouse were very helpful in the upper Green River of Wyoming, and that if you accumulate all of these conservation efforts, both avoidance and positive conservation actions, it actually covered about 2/3 of the mule deer migration corridors, 3/4 of mule deer stopover habitat along those routes, and depending on the population, somewhere between half to 90% of wintering areas. So sage grouse can be an effective umbrella. We just need to be conscious of where that's not true. And Jason Tack in Montana, I believe, found that over half of pronghorn migration corridors were within state and federally designated sage grouse core areas and would presumably benefit from those protections, but that means almost half were not. Next slide, please. So the take-home message is not that sage-grouse can't be a helpful umbrella. It's that we need to understand the gaps in the coverage of the sagebrush umbrella. And this is an example. This is a zoom in on that pygmy rabbit slide that Pat showed earlier. This shows the minimum occupied areas for pygmy rabbits and the modeled suitable habitat for pygmy rabbits, and the overlap of those places. The really dark color is where those overlap with priority habitat management areas for sage-grouse. And I've just highlighted a few pretty significant gaps where there is no priority habitat for sage-grouse, and yet fairly important either occupied or potentially occupied habitats for pygmy rabbits. So, and in fact, the PHMAs only cover 61% of those areas that are known to contain pygmy rabbits, and about half of those areas that are modeled as potential highly suitable habitat where we haven't documented occupancy. So inadequate coverage, we can't assume, I should say, that sage-grouse conservation efforts are going to pick up these other species. Next slide, please. And in fact, if you zoom in at a finer scale as how animals actually use these habitats and compare them to sage-grouse seasonal habitats, there's a number of papers in the literature, and I've just summarized some of those here. Sage thrasher, for instance, overlaps with sage-grouse seasonal habitat use quite a bit in their breeding distribution. So pretty good coverage in those areas where there are protections for sage-grouse. You're going to provide pretty good coverage for sage thrasher. Other sagebrush dependent species like sagebrush sparrow and brewer sparrow, because they're using sagebrush differently than sage-grouse are, there's only moderate coverage. And when you get to those species that are primarily grassland or shrubland species that overlap with sagebrush, really low coverage, and not surprisingly, savanna sparrow, grasshopper sparrow, and green-tailed towhee. And of course, there's virtually no overlap with pinyon jay, which primarily breeds in pinyon juniper habitats. Next slide, please. So take-home message again is that sage-grouse-centric protections may not conserve other sagebrush species, even when they're either their range overlaps or their seasonal habitats overlap, because fine-scale habitat use may differ. Pygmy rabbits, for instance, just as obligated to sagebrush as sage-grouse, they don't use the same habitats very often. And the other less obvious result is that if we have land use restrictions for sage-grouse in place, and we use those to shift disturbances away from seasonal sage-grouse habitat, we may be shifting them into important habitats for other species. And we really need to consider, particularly those of conservation concern, we need to consider whether we're maybe helping sage-grouse while hurting pygmy rabbits or pinyon jays. And we need to expand our focus from management for a single species to managing diversity and complexity of all sagebrush wildlife. And really the way in which we can do that is to manage for diverse, healthy, resistant and resilient, and also connected sagebrush plant communities. And it's really going back in time in some respects, but evolving past this emphasis on sage-grouse to an emphasis on sagebrush. And that's really the direction that part A and B of the strategy, I think, are leaning. I think that's the last slide.
I think you have one more, Tom.
Okay, let's have that one.
Yep, and then if you can wrap up, we do have a question in the queue.
Okay, yeah, I did want to conclude with this, somewhat motivational in the sense that really try to impart some importance to this effort. We are winning some battles. There's some great, inspiring and meaningful conservation successes across the biome. We read about them on Sage West all the time, but we are still losing the war on sagebrush, sage-grouse, and other sagebrush species. We're burning on average about 1 million acres a year. We're restoring a tiny fraction of that. So the real question is, how do we get to this point where we're coordinating and collaborating at a landscape scale and versus focusing on individual species or small areas? We believe the successful conservation approaches and techniques are out there, and we're going to tune in tomorrow. We're going to talk about a number of those then. So question.
All right. Thank you very much, Tom and Pat. And we did have a submitted question from Charles Sanford. This one specifically is to Pat, although I'm sure you could comment on it, Tom. The question is, are the 21% of acres burned counting only unique acres, that is not reburned acres? Pat? And yeah, Pat or Tom.
Yeah, let me handle that one. I think I was involved in the chapter in the strategy. They're not unique. So there certainly could be some duplication of reburns of previously burned areas. I don't think that would be a huge number, but they're not unique.
Okay.
I think the key point is that it's 21% of designated priority habitats that have been burned, and they may have been burned multiple times, yes.
Okay, thank you, Pat. And Charles, I hope that answered your question. Looking for any hands raised or any other submitted questions on the wildlife piece. Not seeing any others. So I think we will go ahead and move on. Thank you so much, Pat and Tom. Really appreciate your presentation.